Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here for another one of my head-to-head videos. Yongnuo has released its first ART series lens, and I'm not a fan of them appropriating Sigma's brand, which I made clear in my review. But to be fair, they did move the needle a bit in terms of optical quality with their new 35mm f1.8 ART lens. But the question is it enough? Enough to shake up the sub $200 APS-C 35mm market. Viltrox's AIR 35mm f1.7 has been out for about 6 months, and it has been probably my favorite inexpensive 35mm lens that has been released on APS-C. So today's comparison is to see whether or not the Yongnuo can dethrone what has been my favorite. Now, before we dive in, let me give you a quick disclosure. Both the Yongnuo and Viltrox lens were sent to me for testing by their respective companies. Neither have sanctioned this head-to-head comparison, and neither have had any kind of input on my creative process. They will see this video when you do, and my thoughts here are my own. We're going to start by taking a look at what is similar between these two lenses. Obviously, they both are the 35mm focal length, which translates to 52.5mm full frame equivalency. So these are essentially normal lenses, giving you that normal angle of view. Both of them have a featureless design in that there are no switches, there's no aperture ring, there's nothing on the barrel besides an actual manual focus ring. Both of them have a similar price. Now, the price of the Yongnuo is not actually settled at this point. I've been told that it will be under $200. Since I do know the price of the Viltrox, its MSRP is $180 US. You can get a little bit cheaper with a discount code, but that tells me that the price is going to be at most within $20. And so I doubt that that is going to be enough of a determining factor to break the bank in either direction. Both of them, as you can see, do come with a lens hood. Both of them use STM focus motors. Both of them have 52mm front filter threads. Both of them have 9 aperture blades. The specifications on paper are pretty close between the two. There's also a couple of differences that I can't say because it's more of a taste thing as to whether or not it is an advantage for one or the other. I'll let you decide, so we'll call these neutral differences. Both of them exhibit just the tiniest amount of distortion. Now, in the case of the Yongnuo, that is a tiny amount of barrel distortion. In the Viltrox, it is a tiny amount of pincushion distortion. Neither one of them makes any difference because it's so minimal that you probably don't even need to correct it. But if you prefer one or the other, there's your difference. Now, a more noticeable difference between the two is when it comes to the color tone of the optical glass. The Yongnuo is definitely the warmer of the two lenses, and even with all settings equalized, same white balance, it's going to consistently deliver a noticeably warmer image than what the Viltrox. So you can decide whether or not from the comparisons, whether the Viltrox is cooler or if the Viltrox is neutral, but there definitely is a difference in the color tone between the two, and you might prefer one look compared to the other. We're going to start by some reasons to choose the Yongnuo lens. It does have the nicer build quality. It is made of nice metals. It has that anodized finish that feels nice. So the materials are a little bit more premium here. It does have some element of weather sealing. It has a gasket at the rear mount. It has a flooring coating up front. Viltrox has their Nano HD coating up front, but there is no weather sealing gasket. So at least you get some weather sealing on the Yongnuo. So that is an advantage. While both of them have STM focus motors, I believe the Yongnuo focuses a little bit faster, and you can see here that if not instant, it's very close and going back to forth in my indoor test. And the Viltrox is good as well, but it's just a hair slower, and so there is a bit of an advantage for the Yongnuo there. The Yongnuo also exhibits less vignette, and so where I needed a plus 55 to correct it, I needed closer to a plus 73 or so with the Viltrox, and so nearly another stop of vignette in the corners, so certainly an advantage there. So there are some reasons to choose the Yongnuo. There are also some reasons to choose the Viltrox. While the Yongnuo has the nicer build quality, the Viltrox is much more compact. In fact, while they have a similar diameter, the Viltrox is 54.3 millimeters in length, whereas the Yongnuo is nearly 80 millimeters in length. So it's a plus 25 difference between the two lenses, 25 millimeters of extra length on the Yongnuo. And so even when it comes to storage in a bag, it may be a make or break situation for you. And because of this, the Viltrox is also noticeably lighter. They call it the AIR series for a reason. And so it weighs in at 170 grams versus 265 grams for the Yongnuo. So that means that it is a full 95 grams lighter. So in this case, that's a third of the weight. And so that is significant, very obviously. So there is some trade-off for the metals that are being used in this versus the tough engineered plastics that are being used in the Viltrox. One feels a little bit more premium, but so far these AIR series lenses have actually held up really well for me. So I don't think that it's actually a poor build quality. The Viltrox, surprisingly, considering it's not the one that's advertising it being the ART series, is actually slightly sharper. Less noticeable in the center of the frame, but certainly in the mid-frame and in the corners. And if you stick around for the optical comparison at the end, you'll see that that is consistent throughout the tested apertures, that it just stays a little more consistently sharp across the frame. Surprisingly, although the Viltrox has a plastic manual focus ring and the Yongnuo has a nicer metal, at least in terms of feeling, manual focus ring, the action of the Yongnuo is not as good. It's not engineered quite as precise, and so it feels like there's a little bit more rubbing. The Viltrox moves more consistently with a better damping. It also manually focuses better. It's a little more consistent. It's easier to do consistent manual focus pulls. I found with the Yongnuo, it's very, very speed sensitive, and because the focus ring isn't perfectly smooth, I just found it a lot harder to get repeatable focus results there. So score another win for Viltrox there. I also found that the Viltrox had better specular highlights, and so there's less activity inside of them. They are a little bit rounder, and so just in terms of the consistency there, I preferred bright specular highlights, bokeh balls if you want to call them that. I preferred them from the Viltrox lens. The Viltrox also is able to focus a little bit closer, 33 centimeters versus 35 centimeters, and achieve a little bit higher level of magnification. It's rated at 0.13 times versus 0.12 times, and surprisingly, that difference is fairly noticeable, as you can see in this comparison here. I also found when it comes to the bokeh quality that, as we'll see in the optical breakdown, in many situations they're more similar than different, but I did find that in the transition zone that there's a little less hard edges on the Viltrox, and so in that really important transition area which can really make or break images, neither one of them are like Sony GM quality. However, I do find that the Viltrox is ever so slightly smoother in those situations. My conclusion, having spent a lot of time with both lenses and shot a lot of head-to-head comparisons, is that in many ways they're very evenly matched lenses. The Yongnuo gives you this slightly nicer build, but at the cost of extra size and weight. I feel like Viltrox is maybe the more polished product. It nails the fine details a little bit better, it's more portable, and so if you're looking to travel light, which many people will with lenses like this, it definitely wins that comparison. They're both fine lenses, and they both actually have a really strong optical performance relative to their price point. You're going to be happy with either lens optically, I suspect. I'm not sure that the ART label is warranted for Yongnuo, because I would expect something a little more groundbreaking to associate that, and I was actually kind of surprised to find that the Viltrox, if anything, was actually the sharper of the two lenses. And so that tells me that it feels like a little bit of stolen valor when it comes to Yongnuo using that ART label that has been proprietary to Sigma for over a decade at this point. You can check out the full text or video reviews of both of these lenses in the description down below, or you can stick around right now and we'll put them head to head and look at how they compare. Let's dive in and take a look. All right, let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. Throughout this series of comparisons, I'm going to have the Yongnuo on the left, the Viltrox on the right. So you can see that the Yongnuo has a tiny bit of barrel distortion, the Viltrox a tiny bit of pincushion distortion. Both of them have some vignette in the corners, however, it is heavier on the Viltrox. Both lenses manually correct fine. Again, Yongnuo left, Viltrox right, and you can see there's no negative impacts left after correction. They look nice and clean. Now we'll take a look at longitudinal style chromatic aberrations. So if we zoom in here, we can see that there is a little bit more fringing from the Viltrox than what there is on the Yongnuo. It's not a significant difference, as you can tell. Neither is going to be enough that you're going to see it in real-world images. However, I do think the Yongnuo is a little bit better. You can also see that in this real-world comparison. Remember, I'm looking at 200% magnification right now, so this is exaggerating it. However, you can see there is a little bit more fringing here in the Viltrox in this area than what there is in the Yongnuo. About equal levels of contrast and detail in this real-world shot, however, a little bit more fringing. Other thing you're going to see as a trend here in general, and that is that the Yongnuo renders, even with the exact same settings in terms of white balance, it renders significantly warmer than what the Viltrox was, and you'll see that as kind of a common thread throughout this. You can see looking at the defocused area, the background, they look largely similar, and we'll kind of hyperanalyze that in just a moment. And when it comes to lateral style chromatic aberrations, you can see that this is an area where the Yongnuo is behind the Viltrox. The Viltrox is nice and clean here. There's just the tiniest bit on this very definite line. More so, however, on the Yongnuo, and definitely the Yongnuo is showing some of that false color on these transition areas, whereas the Viltrox is nice and clean. So how about resolution and contrast? Again, we're showing at 200% here, and this is at 26 megapixels here on Sony. Wide open, I would say that I slightly favor the amount of contrast that is shown on the Viltrox. The level of resolution is similar. There's not a lot of difference there. We can see that little bit of difference when it comes to the metering and thus the overall exposure. That is, it's a little bit faster, a shutter speed on the Viltrox because of that slightly faster maximum aperture. If we move into the mid-frame, however, I think more of an advantage emerges for the Viltrox that definitely has more clear contrast, and thus the details look a little crisper. That's true down into the corner as well, where you can see it definitely favors the contrast, definitely favors the Viltrox lens. We'll pop up into the upper left corner here as well, and you can see it's, if anything, it's even more obvious up here. I think that does bear out in this real-world shot here as well, even though they both, I think, look great. If you look in the overall textures here of the sail on this model ship, you can just see there's more definite contrast, thus the details just pop a little bit better when you compare the two. Stopping both lenses down to f2, so we have really more of an apples-to-apples comparison here. You can see that the contrast still favors the Viltrox. The amount of resolution is just very, very similar in the center of the frame. Still very slightly favoring the Viltrox here in the mid-frame, though I think that margin is closer. Up in the corners, however, the Viltrox still maintains a pretty significant advantage. That advantage remains at f2.8, popping back to the center for the moment. It looks less obvious there, but definitely in the corners you can see it. If we go to landscape aperture, f5.6, we can see that they look pretty similar in the center of the frame. Mid-frame, still slightly Viltrox, and up into the corners. Again, it's closer now, but it still favors the Viltrox, and I think that's true in both corners that you look at. Viltrox just definitely wins for, I would say, mid-frame and corner sharpness all across. The two lenses are pretty close in the center of the frame. Now, the Viltrox wins in terms of minimum focus distance and thus maximum magnification. And you can see here that it definitely is showing a higher level of magnification. And if you look up close, I would say that it's doing a very slightly better job in terms of the contrast there in the area of focus. Now, interestingly, in this, or kind of using a three-dimensional object, I actually liked the way that the Yongnuo handled it better. I feel like the up-close contrast, it favored the Yongnuo a little bit, and that could be, depth of field is small in these kind of situations, plays a factor, but I just feel like it's controlling the contrast a little bit better, and basically anywhere that I look, anything that's in focus, I think that the Yongnuo is a little bit better up close. Now, this comparison shows us a couple of things. First of all, levels of contrast in this three-dimensional setting, very, very similar. You can see that mild difference when it comes to fringing. You can see it's pretty neutral here. There's a little bit of a green fringing here, and then also in this area, more obvious fringing. Nothing significant. However, if we look at the specular highlights, I definitely prefer the Viltrox. The Yongnuo has this kind of weird little cutout shape, and it's also just got a lot more basic busyness going on. The amount, the geometry is similar, but very slightly better on the Viltrox. Just keeps a more consistent type of shape, and thus a little bit less of that that kind of lemon shape in the corners. It's there on both of them, but more prominent on the Yongnuo. If we stop down to f2, we can see that neither of them has perfect specular highlights. The Viltrox wins for having very slightly rounder, and then also just slightly larger and softer looking, and a little bit less of that deformation in the corners. By f2.8, the Viltrox is definitely winning here because they're just getting a little bit weird shaped on the Yongnuo. Neither one of them has like perfect circular shapes all across, but the Viltrox is much closer to achieving that. So if we go out into the real world and we compare the performance there when it comes to overall rendering, again, contrast and detail is close. I slightly like the Yongnuo better. However, if I look at a few zones like this, I feel like in this transition zone, the Yongnuo isn't quite as good. Up here as well, we can just see that there's a little bit more hard edges. It's still not great here on the Viltrox, but just a little bit smoother in general. Looking into this zone, however, I think that they look more similar than different. Not a tremendous amount of difference there. But once again, I think in this zone right here, even though I still see some outlining, it's a little smoother, whereas here I definitely see some of that more busy outlining that catches my eye. And so Viltrox, I think, is a little better in the transition zones. Here's another shot where I think the results, other than that being warmer, as I've pointed out previously, I think that the end results are really more similar than different. They both have similar levels of contrast. If you look at areas like this, they don't really look very different. The specular highlights that are shown here, because they're a little less definite, they really don't look all that different, and I don't see like a huge advantage for the f1.7 versus f1.8 in terms of the general defocus of the background. A couple of final shots where there is sun right out of frame, and I did see situations where the Yongnuo showed a little bit more flare, but putting them in this identical situation, my biggest takeaway is mostly that how much warmer the Yongnuo image looks. As I look at the subject area, they seem to be showing similar levels of detail. As I just look generally at the background here, which is a little further away, you know, they both look about the same. The sun's coming in through here, but I don't see any flare artifacts from either one of them. Moving back a little bit further, again, the sun is right up in this area, right out of frame. It's the same truth. It's the biggest takeaway is that the image looks warmer from the Yongnuo, and the settings are identical in terms of white balance here. So Viltrox definitely looks cooler. Yongnuo looks a little bit warmer. And as far as the overall rendering of the scenes, I think they look very, very similar. So thanks for sticking around to the end. Hopefully a look at the optical performance of these two lenses has helped you to decide which one is the one for you, or you say, maybe neither of them. It's your money. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.